Welcome to Class 11 for Hebrew Exegesis, BRITE Old Testament 506. Today we're going to be talking about the first of several steps in the interpretive process, putting together all the pieces of exegesis that we've been studying over the semester. Just a quick orientation of where we are in the exegetical process. We have discussed historical analysis, which is the background of the text, authorship, date of writing, audience, etc. We have discussed literary analysis, at least literary analysis part 1, which is the genre of the text. Is it a psalm? Is it history? Is it law? We've discussed critical analysis, what is in the text, and determining the correct textual variant. And we've discussed lexical analysis, which is word studies, the semantics of the text. We've discussed syntactical analysis, comprehending how the various parts of the text hold together. And structural analysis, which we just wrapped up, diagramming the text, understanding what exegetical questions need to be answered, and explaining how we have answered those particular questions. Which brings us then back to literary analysis, not back to genre, but to the actual context of the text. This is an important question when it comes to interpretation because the interpretation must fit within the context of the text. So how does the text fit contextually within the rest of a book, within history, within time? How does it fit within Scripture as a whole? What is the actual context of the text that we're looking at? This is the last piece, as it were, of the exegetical process, because once this piece is complete, we'll be able to move on to exegetical analysis and actually determine the interpretation of the text. In this way, literary analysis is sort of like the guardrails, explaining where we cannot go with our interpretation, indicating what the context is of the text so that we know within what context we need to determine the interpretation. When we talk about literary analysis and context, there are several different kinds of context that we need to talk about. There is textual context, that is, how does this particular passage fit in with the rest of the book, the rest of its chapter, the rest of the verse, the rest of the Old Testament. There's also the theological context. How does the interpretation of this text relate to the theology of the book and the theology of the Old Testament as a whole? And then there's historical context, which is what we're going to talk about today. What impact does the particular historical time, the setting in time where the passage is being examined, what difference does that make on the text? Let me give 4 examples here. We begin with the context of the original author. What did the original author intend when he or she wrote down the words that are recorded for us in Scripture? We teach theologically that this particular author was inspired and that they wrote the inspired, inerrant words of God. So what exactly did they mean when they said them? This doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't other understandings of the text, but at least with its initial context, what did the author intend? And how did that original audience understand the passage? Not so much how did they understand, because Israel often misunderstood, but how should they have understood the words of the original author? And then there's the question of future generations in Israel, subsequent generations in Israel that come after the original author. How did they understand the passage? Prior to the time of Christ, still in the era of the Old Testament, how did they view the text in question? And then when we talk about early Christians, we have another historical context. What did the early Christians understand, Christologically speaking, now that Christ had come and fulfilled the Old Testament? Now that they had Christ crucified and risen again, what impact did that make on the interpretation of Old Testament texts? And then there's the final question, what should we understand? What exactly should we interpret from the Scriptures to impact our lives today? Now, 2 of these questions are actually within the realm of exegesis, and that's the first 2, especially Old Testament exegesis, as we're trying to understand how the Old Testament understood itself, and what the Old Testament originally meant in its original context, in its original Jewish context. The question of what did early Christians understand from the text is something that really is impacted by the New Testament and New Testament studies. That is not to suggest that the Old Testament is not Christological. It certainly is. However, bringing out the Christological message of an Old Testament text is not really Old Testament exegesis. That's really Old Testament exegesis through the lens of the New Testament. We might call that canonical exegesis, or even Old Testament use of the New or New Testament use of the Old, understanding how the 2 testaments relate to each other. It's an extremely important part of the hermeneutical process, the interpretation of Scripture, but in terms of exegesis and exegeting the Old Testament as the Old Testament, this doesn't really factor in. Nor does what should we understand from this. This is entering into application to our lives today and is not even really within the realm of hermeneutics. It's actually more within the realm of homiletics, teaching a group of people today how the meaning, the interpretation of an ancient text impacts their lives today. So really, within the exegetical process, we are looking at the first two. What did the original author intend? What did the original audience understand, or what should they have understood? And what did subsequent generations understand within Israel? As we discuss historical context within a literary framework, we have to keep in mind that genre will make an impact on our interpretation, literarily, of a particular text. For instance, prophecies are understood to be future. However, the point of a prophecy was not to encourage future generations. The point of a prophecy was to encourage the generation to whom the prophecy was being given. However, once that generation died, future generations would then read that same prophecy and take the same encouragement, or in some cases, look back at the fulfillment of that prophecy. So we need to examine both the original audience, the original author of that particular prophecy, but also how future generations understood that prophecy. The same is true of law. Sometimes laws would be replaced or would become irrelevant over time for future generations. Covenants would often be replaced. And history that took place in a particular time, a particular setting, historically, was written down in order to encourage future generations of Israelites. So how did those Israelites view the original writing of the text? And then there are prayers and songs that were uttered in a particular circumstance at a particular time for a particular reason, and yet they became part of Israel's worship for hundreds, even thousands of years, and in some cases are even used today. So how are we supposed to view these within an Old Testament context, both in their original setting, from their original author, but also understanding that even the author grasped the fact that some of these would be used in future generations of Israel's worship? So how do we treat these particular texts? Well, we will examine each of these in a particular order, starting with prophecy and working through prayers and songs, examining each one in greater detail to understand how that particular genre should be interpreted literarily and historically. The first genre that we'll start with is prophecy. We need to be careful as we examine prophecy that we examine it within its proper historical context, because there are several layers of context historically. There is the original author who is declaring the words to an original audience. However, those words in some cases were not written down until a later generation, perhaps written down by that prophet's disciples or later scribes, creating a second historical context. But then those words are read by future generations, creating a third historical context, plus there is the generation where the prophecy will actually be fulfilled, which creates a fourth historical context. So as we're studying the text, we need to make sure that we're interpreting the passage according to what is actually in the text in its own historical context. For instance, Isaiah 7 and 8, Isaiah 7 says, "The virgin shall be with child and give birth to a son, and you shall call him Emmanuel." However, in chapter 8 of Isaiah, Isaiah goes to a prophetess who conceives and gives birth to a child, and they name him Mahar-shalal-Hashbaz, which has to do with the hurrying of the plunder, as the Syrians are going to be destroyed alongside the Israelites by the Assyrians, who are going to come in under Tiglath-Pileser and destroy Samaria. Now the question has to do with the fulfillment. It would appear that chapter 8 is the fulfillment of chapter 7. However, we know from the book of Matthew that this was not fulfilled, and that this is actually a messianic prophecy. However, I don't think that Isaiah actually understood it as a messianic prophecy, any more than he understood that the mighty God, Prince of Peace, Everlasting Father would be Jesus. I think he understood that more so as Hezekiah, the king who would come as the anointed one to sit on the throne. In that sense, a Messiah, not necessarily the Messiah. So we need to be careful when we use this word fulfillment, because it makes it sound like it's over, it's done with, and there is no other importance prophetically to the particular message, which, again, as we see in Isaiah 7 and 8, is not true. There is an interpretation that still lingers Christologically from the New Testament, even though it seems complete or fulfilled in the Old Testament. A better word might be accordance, that the events of the future accord with that particular prophecy. This allows for there to be multiple accordances of particular events to a prophecy, rather than giving the impression that the prophecy is over and done with and that we can look at it as just a fulfilled prophecy that's really cool because it's done. Instead, we leave the door open and say that there are things that God is doing that we simply know nothing about, which is the case of Isaiah. So as we're interpreting Isaiah 7 and 8 in its context within Isaiah, we would make the case that Isaiah did not fully understand that chapter 8 was not the final fulfillment. It just simply accorded with chapter 7. In fact, future generations may not have understood that chapter 8 accorded with chapter 7 rather than fulfilled it, because future generations of Israelites may have looked back on this passage and said, well, that's over and done with, so we don't need to look at it. However, there are other passages like Isaiah 14 and later in Isaiah 18 that talk about Babylon. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. However, as we read that passage through a New Testament lens, we understand that Babylon has become the catch-all, the foil, as it were, to interpret the final kingdom, the satanic kingdom, that stands against God. So that in Revelation, John uses these words, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. So again, is Isaiah really talking about the city of Babylon? Absolutely. Is Isaiah talking about more than the city of Babylon? Apparently. Did Isaiah understand that? No, he did not. But future generations did, because Ezekiel, as he is prophesying about the fall of Babylon as well, as do other prophets in the Old Testament. And they're not always speaking, historically, they're not always speaking of Babylon, because some of them are actually prophesying after the time of Babylon. So again, it is significant to remember who it is that's writing initially, and the initial interpretation of the text. We can interpret that accordingly, and then we can go on to future generations of Israelites and see how they would interpret it, and then move ahead to the New Testament and see how we understand it. Does that mean that any of those interpretations of past generations is wrong? Absolutely not. It just simply means that they only understood so much within their particular historical context. Perhaps the most famous example is Isaiah 41, where Jesus stands up in Luke and says that this particular passage is fulfilled in the presence of all those gathered there, because he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. However, as Jesus is quoting Isaiah 41, he stops in the middle of a sentence, and he does not say that he has come to proclaim vengeance. Instead, he suggests that that is for a later time. He leaves that out completely, instead focusing on the liberation of the poor and the sick, releasing those from prison. Anybody looking at Isaiah 41 would just assume that the first part of the verse goes with the second part of the verse, but not Jesus. He reinterprets that verse completely. Is that wrong to say in the Old Testament that they understood the coming of the vengeance alongside the coming of salvation? Certainly not. They understood appropriately that both of those were coming. What they did not understand is that that was going to come in two stages, the already but the not yet, that salvation would come and vengeance would wait. So here we have, in these three particular examples, we have some cautions as we examine the historical context of prophecy. We're looking for accordance, not necessarily for fulfillment. We need to examine the passage in prophecy within its original setting. What was the message that was being communicated to those who heard the prophecy for the very first time? We then need to consider, why were these words written down? There are some people who have suggested that Hosea, for instance, a northern prophet, actually became a very popular message within the southern kingdom, and that many of his words were used by later prophets, re-emphasizing his message, but not for the original northern audience, instead re-emphasizing it for a southern audience. We need to examine subsequent generations and see how later generations understood those passages, understood them as messianic in many cases, but also understood them as fulfilled, but not so much fulfilled as much as according. They saw events that lined up with the prophecy. Were they looking for future events, or were they satisfied that one event had come? Again, this is the exegetical process of examining the passage within its original historical context, the context of the Old Testament, both from the original declaration of the prophecy up through the time of Christ, ending just before Christ. How did the people in the Old Testament understand their prophetic texts? Laws are one of the more fascinating instances of historical context affecting the interpretation of a text. For instance, in Leviticus chapter 17, we have a law that has become outdated. As we remember the fact that we have over 1,000 years of case law in the Old Testament, occasionally laws no longer apply. So in Leviticus 17, the people are commanded that they may not offer meat at their tents. They may not kill it there and eat it. Instead, they have to take it to the central tabernacle, which makes sense because they're all living in the same camp. However, in Deuteronomy chapter 12, we're told that if they want to eat meat, they can simply kill the animal at their house. They don't have to travel all the way to Jerusalem every time they get a craving for a T-bone. In some cases, though, the laws simply become irrelevant or start out as irrelevant. For instance, in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 8 through 9, the people are told that they need to build a parapet around the edge of their roof, a guardrail, so that people do not fall off and be killed, which is not very loving for your neighbor. They're also told that they need to be careful when they plant vineyards not to plant two kinds of seed in the same field. However, in Deuteronomy chapter 22, the people are living in tents in the plains of Moab. They don't have houses. They don't have vineyards. And so we need to examine the interpretation of this text within its original setting. What would the people of Israel have understood? They would have understood this both as a law but also as a promise. You are going to have a house. You are going to have vineyards. God is going to fulfill his promises to you. And then they would have understood in future generations that that was a law they were actually supposed to follow. However, in some cases, there were laws that they did not seem to follow. For instance, Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 18 to 21, where they're told about bringing a rebellious son to the gates of the city and executing him. We wonder, though, in the fact that we have never seen this done in the Old Testament or the New Testament. A child is never executed for disobedience. Does that mean that the children were never disobedient in the Old Testament? Does that mean that parents didn't take child discipline seriously enough? Why is it that we don't see a historical instance of this law being applied? The same is true even of the festivals. We see in Leviticus and Deuteronomy great explanation of all the festivals that are supposed to be followed, and yet throughout all the historical books we see references to the fact that they're not followed. They say a Passover like this had never been celebrated since the time of David. In fact, in some instances they say it hadn't been celebrated at all since the time of David. So how come we have laws that have been seemingly ignored? This makes an impact on our interpretation. Both the interpretation and understanding of the text itself, what was required, but also an understanding historically as to why it wasn't followed, even though it was required. And then finally, we have instances of laws that are adapted, such as 2 Samuel 5:8, where we're told that David said that in order to take Jerusalem, you're going to have to go up the water shaft and attack the blind and the lame, because he had been mocked, saying not even the blind and the lame could get into Jerusalem. However, this became a law saying that the blind and the lame were not allowed in the house, perhaps referencing Jerusalem as a whole, but maybe offering a suggestion as to why the blind and the lame were not allowed in the temple. So here we have a historical context that has been shifted into law, which then affected future generations. So as we examine a law, we need to examine it within the context it was given, but also the later generations and how they may or may not have followed it. It's also important to consider the historical context of covenants. For one thing, covenants were passed on to subsequent generations, so we need to ask ourselves, is the covenant still in force? For instance, Genesis 12 is the covenant with Abraham, and we need to ask ourselves, does this particular covenant still apply to later generations of Israelites? The impression is that it does, that Israel was to continue being a blessing to the nations, until finally Christ would come as the ultimate blessing. But Genesis 12 was supposed to have a great impact upon their behavior. There's also the question of a broken and perhaps abandoned covenant. For instance, in Genesis chapter 2, we have the covenant that is given to Adam, not eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then we have in chapter 3 the actual breaking of that covenant. However, what's fascinating is that this breaking of the covenant in the Old Testament is very rarely mentioned in the Old Testament. It's given far more weight in Paul in the book of Romans and Galatians than it is throughout the Old Testament. So we need to consider both that it happened and why it happened, but at least within Old Testament theology, we need to understand that they understood this particular covenant as having been broken and violated, and that there was an establishment of a new covenant. Not the new covenant, but there was a new covenant that in many ways replaced, although that's the wrong word, in many ways superseded or solved the issue of the covenant with Adam, for instance, the covenant with Moses, so that they sacrificed animals to death because death was the punishment from the first covenant in Genesis chapter 2. So again, as we examine various covenantal passages throughout the Old Testament, we need to keep these covenants in mind and understand how Israel was viewing those covenants. For instance, how did they view the Davidic covenant after the time of the exile, when there was no Davidic king reigning? There's also the question of emphasis. Certain covenants will be emphasized again. For instance, in Genesis chapter 9, we see a covenant made with Noah, which is oftentimes referred to as a covenant with creation, although this could also go back to Genesis 1 and 2. What's fascinating is that Jeremiah 33 talks about a covenant with the sun and the moon, that they would continue to shine, a covenant with creation. So here we have a covenant that is clearly understood by later generations and is used by other generations. So as we examine Genesis chapter 9, we see the meaning of Genesis chapter 9, we see the interpretation of Genesis chapter 9, but then we also, as we look at other passages, need to see how they understood Genesis chapter 9. For instance, how did Jeremiah grasp the importance of Genesis chapter 2 and Genesis chapter 9? So here again we have covenant, and examining covenant within its historical context, the context in which the covenant was originally given, but then also the context of subsequent generations who would live under that covenant. How did this covenant impact them in their lives? Obviously, history falls within the category of historical context because there's the history of when the event actually happened, but then also the history of interpretation, as later generations of Israelites considered that historical event and the impact that it was supposed to make on them. Sometimes we differentiate between history and historiography. That is, history is the facts of what happened, and historiography is writing about those facts. However, these are Western categories. The ancient Israelites only understood history, and they didn't understand history as just the facts. Instead, history had a clear message, and it was the message that was just as important as the facts. Because of this, a particular set of facts may be not interpreted in a different way, but have a different emphasis. For instance, the difference between 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. 1st and 2nd Kings talks about both kingdoms. 1st and 2nd Chronicles only talks about Judah. 1st and 2nd Chronicles is very much focused on the palace and the king. 1st and 2nd Chronicles is focused on the temple and the king. So here we have the same set of facts. They don't contradict. The same set of facts, but for two completely different reasons. And so as we examine the text, we need to remember that at different parts in history, these texts had different emphases, a different message that was being communicated. So there's the historical context of the actual event, but there's also the historical context of the writer, as the writer is writing with a clear goal in mind. In some cases, the author will actually tell us how it has been adapted and used for his purposes. For instance, in Genesis 22:14, it says, Abraham says to Isaac, "The Lord will provide." But then the commentary says there in the same verse, "This is why it said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." Understanding that, according to tradition, Mount Moriah actually became the seat of the temple. The temple was placed in the same place that Abraham was going to offer Isaac, at least according to Israelite tradition. And so here we have a historical interpretation of a past event, but the impact that it's making on the building of the temple, but then the impact that would have been understood by future generations, as each of them would come to the temple understanding God will provide, looking ahead to that perfect sacrifice, Jesus Christ, who would come as Isaac. The final genre to consider as we think about historical context are songs and prayers. Remember that there is a historical context where the particular song or prayer was originally written. However, there is also the historical context where the prayer or song would be read and used by future generations. For instance, as we examine Psalm 51 from an individual perspective, we understand it as referring to David's sin with Bathsheba. However, David also wrote the song for the choir master, meaning that it was supposed to be understood as a general psalm of confession. So there's an individual specific interpretation of Psalm 51. There's also a corporate understanding of Psalm 51, understanding that it applies to every believer in God and not just to David. So we have to have both in this particular instance. There's also the question of adaptation, as we consider the ways that particular psalms have been adapted. That is, how those particular psalms have been used, both in the Old Testament but also in the New Testament. For instance, Psalm 125 is a song of ascents, and yet as we read Psalm 125, we realize that David is praying, again, an individual psalm, and yet it has been used corporately as a psalm of ascent, so that it became one of the psalms that the pilgrims, the Israelite pilgrims, would use as they headed up to Jerusalem 4 times a year to offer sacrifices, proclaiming their faith in God. There's also, of course, Psalm 110, where David says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And David really feels that way, except we, of course, know that Christ uses this psalm to speak of him. And probably not just Christ, it probably referred to many different Israelite kings who probably saw this as relating to them. Very much the same as Psalm 2 that talks about the Son seated on the throne, which would have been understood by Israel not just as the Messiah, but as every king from the line of David, the Davidic king who is God's son. So again, we need to be careful as we examine these passages within their historical context to see how they would have been interpreted by future generations as well as what was intended by the original audience. There's also certain psalms that appear to be ignored over time. For instance, Psalm 137, which talks about the people weeping when they're in Babylon. This is a psalm that's not one that you put in a fun Easter celebration, and yet we wonder why Israel didn't appear to use this psalm very much either. We don't have a psalm like it, or this psalm in particular, that used in the New Testament. So what happened to this particular psalm? Did the historical context make it irrelevant? Was it a song only to be sung in Babylon? Or was this a song that was supposed to cause the Israelites to remember the past exile in Babylon and to continue to pursue righteousness? Again, we have to ask ourselves those historical interpretive questions because we're asking, how did the original authors understand it? How did the original audience understand it? And then how did future generations of Israelites, even the next generation after the generation to return from exile, how did they understand it? Well, that brings us to the end of this lecture. As we wrap up, let me give a word of caution. Sometimes we give the impression that the meaning of a text will change with each historical context. Let me be clear in saying that the meaning of a text does not typically change. Instead, the way that various generations understand the meaning of that text will continually change as they read the psalm or the law or the covenant or the history in their particular historical context. So again, the text itself is not changing. The intent of the text is not changing. It's really the interpretation, the understanding of the text that is shifting over time as the Israelites came to understand what previous generations of Israelites had written. So we have a unique situation as we interpret these particular passages some 2,000 to 4,000 years later, as we're examining a text that was not written originally for us, but now has been given to us by the power of the gospel. And so as we read these texts, we need to be careful not just to examine them with our own context, but to examine them within the context they were originally written. But even then, not just when they were originally written, but how they were understood before the time of Christ by other Israelites. So that over time, as we come to the New Testament and as we come to our interpretation of the text, we're able to incorporate several of these historical contexts into it in order to understand what exactly it is that the people are proclaiming as they hear the word of God being declared to them. Well, again, this brings us to the end of our lecture. Hopefully this interpretation lecture has made sense. If not, we'll discuss it in class. Please prepare your passage and study your vocab, and I will see you soon.